I think I may have talked about this story before, but in a different context. I could be wrong, but my understanding is that they're radical feminists, right? They're called trans exclusionary, and they're on panels with conservatives talking about how the trans rights movement is erasing, lesbians and things like that. And there's an interesting framing to the story, and it's not typically what I talked about. Basically, the video I talked about before was kind of how it's been going on for a long time that radical feminists are at odds with trans inclusive and trans. It's complicated. It is. But you basically have lesbians protesting Pride in London. You had an incident where lesbians stormed into a room and started, I don't know how you describe it, protesting or confronting a trans rights activist who is a trans woman. And there's a faction of the feminist left that is now essentially meeting with conservatives. So this is what's interesting about it. From NBC News, conservative group hosts anti-transgender panel of feminists from the left. And they say, divide and conquer? The Conservative Heritage Foundation hosted a panel of radical feminists fighting trans rights. I got to point out, there's an interesting phenomenon happening where the left is slowly, you know what? The way I framed this before is that imagine you have two big platforms, the left and the right. Oh, you can't see my hands. Two big platforms. The right is full of conservatives for the most part. The left is full of liberals for the most part. But over time, people on the left, on the farthest fringe, are literally pushing people off of this platform. And conservatives love the support and love, bringing people in who will then give them power. It's almost like as the Democratic Party becomes fractured by the far left, by, Ocasio-Cortez won't vote to fund the government if DHS, ICE is included in it. And now my understanding is she's roping in the other progressives. You've got pretty fringe elements like Ilhan Omar, who praised the black Hebrew Israelites, defended them, I should say, and saying things about Israel. You can see that the fringe of the far left is becoming more dominant. And because of this, even radical feminists, not regular ones, radical feminists are now sitting and breaking bread with conservatives. This is ultimately good news for conservatives because what you have on the right is mostly uniform. It's people, they're coming together around certain ideas, and the left is being broken apart. Disaffected leftists are now going and communicating and breaking bread and voting to the right. A lot of people I know who used to be on the left, who used to be liberal, who now claim to be conservative, actually still hold liberal positions and social liberal positions, typically things you'd find from like mainstream Democrats. But because we repeatedly see the grasping, the adoption of identitarianism on the left, these people are leaving and would rather vote for a conservative. And my God, what better example than this? A conservative group hosting radical feminists. How have we got to the point where the far left is creating unity in the United States? They're so extreme and insane that they're actually pushing even radical leftists to conservatives where they're communicating, shaking hands. I kid you not. Isn't this so crazy? There's a prominent feminist in Canada who was banned from Twitter for saying, quote, "Men aren't women, though." And she's talking, I think she did an interview with Ben Shapiro about it. Like, how could they come to the point where conservatives and radical feminists are like, this is interesting, let's have a conversation. Well, let's read this story. The Conservative Heritage Foundation, which has long advocated against LGBTQ rights, hosted a panel in Washington on Monday titled, "The Inequality of the Equality Act Concerns from the Left." But instead of highlighting the left's opposition to the Equality Act, which seeks to add LGBTQ protections to federal civil rights laws, all four panelists had one thing in common. They oppose transgender rights. If gender identity becomes a protected class in federal civil rights law, there will be serious negative consequences, Ryan T. Anderson, a senior research fellow at the foundation and the event's moderator, said in his introduction. The increase in those identifying as transgender, he added, has become an epidemic. I'd like to point out, I think when it comes to, they say to a hammer, everything looks like a nail, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, etc. There's many idioms and phrases that allude to basically, if you're of a certain particular ideology, you will find your opponents are the biggest threat in the world because they're literally affecting your worldview. I don't believe the issue of trans rights is becoming epidemic. I do believe that there is a potential, based on scientific research, there's something called rapid onset gender dysphoria. I'm not a scientist, psychologist, nor an expert. I'm only pointing out these studies exist and they're matters of great contention in the culture war. I'm not trying to suggest one thing is true or not, but I want to point out people are now saying this may be the case, and thus the potential exists. So I don't think it's fair to call it an epidemic. I think that rhetoric comes from those who are most threatened by these moves. But I believe one of the biggest concerns you will see among radical feminists, particularly, is that allowing anyone to identify as a woman means that certain protections for women will be removed to it in a sense. And I've explained this before, so I'll only go over this a little bit. But basically, we create a women's league in sports because men are bigger, faster, stronger, etc. On average. Not always, but on average. Thus, the best of the best in terms of being a male athlete is going to be better than the best of the best than a female athlete. That's a fact, okay? Then we can also take the average male and put them up against the average female, and they'll still likely be better. So what ends up happening is, in some circumstances, we have seen biological males who identify as women beating biological females because they have a massive advantage. The most recent news was that Powerlifting USA was banning transgender people straight up, like outright. And they said female to male were being banned because androgens are considered a performance enhancer, and male to female were being banned because they have a natural advantage having developed as males. So there is this backlash coming. But essentially, there's many different areas where women, being on average smaller, less bone density, less muscle mass, have been given a safe space from biological males. It has nothing to do with identity, it has nothing to do with transgender, it has to do with the fact that there's a biological difference between the sexes, which apparently is controversial, but let's read on. Those invited by Heritage to share their concerns from the left included 3 women from the Women's Liberation Front, or WOLF, a self-described radical feminist organization best known for its opposition to transgender rights, and Hassie Horvath, an adjunct lecturer at the University of California, San Francisco, who formerly identified as transgender. Throughout their hour-long discussion, the 4 panelists, at least 2 of them LGBTQ, shared similar views on transgender people and the rights many in the trans community are currently seeking. Horvath likened the trans rights movement to the new eating disorder. That's a bit extreme, in my opinion. And Jennifer Chavez, a WOLF member, read from a letter that described increased transgender visibility and acceptance as a social contagion all over the internet. As I mentioned, there is an idea going around. Some people there have been preliminary surveys which have been removed because they're contentious about something called rapid onset gender dysphoria. I think that's what they're referring to. In a Facebook post on Tuesday, WOLF defended its members' participation in the Heritage panel, saying, their foremost concern is the safety and bodily integrity of the women and children whose lives will be put at risk or ruined if gender identity legally replaces sex under law. So, I mean, the main point isn't necessarily, look, obviously NBC News has their opinion, and they're taking a stance that's more pro-trans and critical of these conservatives. But I do want to point something out that's very important, okay? This is outside of the idea of transgender rights. There is something interesting there's going to be a negative consequence of many of these laws, and I'll use New York as a good example. New York's human rights law recognizes 31 different genders. Some of them are redundant, right? They list female to male, but also FTM, which basically mean the same thing, but they've listed them. However, in the law itself, it says you can identify as literally anything you want, okay? And the reason for this is so that, at its core, it makes sense. If you're born male and identify as female, they want to prevent discrimination against you in public accommodation. So, I use a hyperbolic, extreme example, Starbucks, for instance. When you go to Starbucks, they will yell out your name when your drink is done. That's a public accommodation. Providing you with coffee is, providing bathrooms, and calling out your name. It's something they provide to the service, or to the public as a service. So the point of the law, in this example, is if you look 100% ripped, buff, masculine, muscles, but you now identify as a woman, and you say your name is, Jacqueline, they can't choose not to say your name. If they're going to call out names, they're going to call out your name regardless. And it's not just gender identity. It's true for national origin, religion. So someone can't discriminate against you and refuse to provide you that service. But now that anyone can identify as anything, clothes don't matter, names don't matter, people can literally say their name is anything. They can wear whatever clothes they want. And I kid you not, someone who is a massive beard, ripped, 270-pound, massive 6'5", wearing a suit, wearing a shirt that says, I am a man, I am biologically male, can tell you they are a woman, and you must provide them the same accommodations. So there is some negative consequence in that. I understand the reason for trying to protect the trans community. Absolutely. They're one of the most vulnerable communities in this country. But it also means there will be exploits. I'm not saying that's a good reason to not have these laws. I just want to make sure it's apparent to people that you can literally now there will come a time where someone will take advantage of this. Many people have said, it's kind of silly to assume a man will go into a woman's bathroom, but that's not what we're seeing. Because of these laws, instead of creating different bathrooms, they're creating one big bathroom space with rooms or stalls, and this is putting biological men and women in the same, males and females in the same space. So there's some criticism of the Heritage Foundation, which is more to the point. Heron Greensmith, a researcher at the liberal think tank Political Research Associates, said the latest iteration of cooperation between conservatives and radical feminists is at least in part a reaction to the incredible gains the trans community has made in terms of civil rights and visibility. They are capitalizing on a scarcity mindset rhetoric, saying there aren't enough rights to go around and therefore we must prioritize cis women over everyone else, Greensmith said, referring to non-transgender women. That's right out of the rights playbook when they say let's prioritize citizens over non-citizens, let's prioritize white people over people of color. Now, I think you get it. I don't need to make this video longer than it needs to be, but I want to end by pointing out, if we've come to a point where NBC News is now trying to insinuate, they're taking quotes, that radical feminists are conservative or playing by the right-wing playbook, that's bad news for the left, not the right, okay? Your platform is shrinking to a rather extreme degree. You're the ones doing it, okay? But you know what? I don't know how you actually solve this problem. One of the issues with intersectionality is trying to bring all of these different groups in together, and many of them are at odds with each other, most notably the Islamic community and the LGBTQ community. We just saw in the UK in Birmingham that parents are protesting LGBTQ curriculum in sex education for various reasons. I'm not saying it's wrong for them to protest, but the point I want to bring up is that they are protesting. So look, in many countries, Muslims do not like LGBTQ people. It's not necessarily true for the U.S. There are many, who are more reformed Muslim. I don't know how you actually describe, but they're okay with it to an extent. But for the most part, it's a conservative religion. So I don't understand how you're going to bring these two communities together. You can't. They'll eventually just, fight. There's a comic by Gary Larson, I think, The Far Side, and it's two aliens looking at a terrarium with a human and a grizzly bear, and the grizzly bear's attacking, and he says, you've put incompatible species in the same space. I'm not trying to insinuate that people of different ideologies are different species. I'm trying to point out that sometimes you have to you just have to recognize certain ideologies can't mix. They don't. And something weird is happening when conservatives and radical feminists are actually in agreement on some of these issues. I think that's the fringe left has taken too much and are pushing too hard, and they're actually pushing even radical leftists to the right. So anyway, stick around. I've got another video coming up on my main channel at 4 p.m. youtube.com/timcast. If you're watching this video at a later date, it's going to be about Venezuela, because it seems like Venezuela is on the verge of collapse. Stick around. I'll see you then.